Juan Mendoza's hands trembled for the first time in 22 years as he gripped the thin sheet of company letterhead. The words mandatory meeting and human resources present blurred before his eyes as a cold weight settled in his stomach. Around him, the factory floor continued its relentless rhythm, the hiss of hydraulic presses, the clang of metal on metal, the shouts of foremen over the industrial din. But for Juan, time seemed to stop. He knew what this meant. Everyone did. If you're enjoying this story, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support helps me share more stories like Juan's with others who need to hear them. Now, let's dive deeper into Juan's journey. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the narrow hallway leading to the executive offices, casting the same sickly glow they had for the past 22 years. Juan's eyes had grown accustomed to them, just as his hands had grown accustomed to the calluses from operating the industrial press for double shifts. At 57, his salt and pepper hair was more salt than pepper now, and the deep lines around his eyes told stories of thousands of overtime hours that never appeared on his paycheck. The persistent pain in his lower back, a souvenir from a workplace injury 5 years ago when he'd been asked to help move equipment just this once because the company couldn't afford proper movers, throbbed as he climbed the stairs to the executive floor. He'd never filed for workers' compensation. Robert had personally asked him not to, promising the company would take care of him. The taking care had amounted to 3 days off without pay and a heating pad that Robert's secretary Diane had brought from her own home. Juan straightened his faded work uniform, the blue collar frayed, the company logo patched twice over, a stark contrast to the gleaming corporate portraits that lined the hallway. Each step toward Robert Keller's office felt like a march to execution. The rumors had been circulating for weeks. Budget cuts, downsizing, restructuring. Corporate words that meant the same thing. People like him were losing their jobs. "You're late, Juan," said Marcus from HR, checking his watch as Juan approached the office door. "Mr. Keller's been waiting." Juan checked his own watch at Timex his eldest son had given him for Christmas 15 years ago. The band replaced 3 times, but the face still reliable. He was 2 minutes early for the 4:30 meeting, but he'd learned long ago not to contradict management. "Sorry," he murmured, his accent still noticeable despite decades in America. Marcus knocked once, then opened the door without waiting for a response. "Mendoza's here," he announced, then stepped aside to let Juan enter while remaining in the doorway, himself a human barrier to escape. "Come in, Juan," Robert Keller said from behind his mahogany desk, not even looking up from his computer screen. The office was a stark contrast to the factory floor, air-conditioned, quiet, with framed awards on the wall documenting precision manufacturing's growth over the decades. Growth that Juan had contributed to with every extra hour, every skipped lunch break, every missed baseball game of his sons, every holiday he'd worked while Robert was in Cancun with his family. Juan sat down in the chair across from Robert, the vinyl cracking beneath his weight. His knees protested, another work injury that had never been properly treated. Through the glass wall behind Robert, Juan could see the factory floor where he'd spent half his life. Just yesterday, he'd repaired the main assembly line for the 3rd time this month, staying 4 hours after his shift, with no overtime pay because the company couldn't afford the new parts it actually needed. "Water?" Robert asked, gesturing to a crystal pitcher on his desk. Juan shook his head. He'd been through enough of these meetings, always as the one doing the extra work, when others were let go to know that false courtesies were part of the ritual. Robert finally looked up, his eyes briefly meeting Juan's before sliding away. At 42, Robert was 15 years younger than Juan. He'd started at the company right out of business school, the son of a board member, initially as Juan's supervisor on the floor. Juan had taught him how the machines worked, had covered for his mistakes, had never mentioned the times Robert disappeared for long meetings that everyone knew were golf games with clients. Now Robert wore tailored suits with gold cufflinks that Juan recognized as Nuhei noticed such things. Noticing details had kept him alive in this company for 22 years. "I'll get right to it," Robert said, closing whatever he'd been looking at on his computer. "The board has mandated staff reductions across all departments. We've had to make some difficult decisions." Juan nodded. He'd survived 3 rounds of layoffs before. Each time he'd watched younger worker sons who made higher wages, who hadn't started at 8.25 an hour in 2000 and two clean out their lockers. Each time he'd been told his dedication was the backbone of the company. Each time he'd picked up their workload without complaint or additional compensation. I know it's been a challenging year, Juan said carefully. I've been thinking of ways we could improve efficiency on the line. If we adjusted the maintenance schedule, maybe? Robert raised his hand, cutting him off. This isn't about efficiency, Juan. It's about numbers, headcount. The board wants a 20% reduction, and we're starting with the highest tenured employees who are, well, at the higher end of our pay scale. Juan almost laughed. After 22 years, he made $19.75 an hour, just 1.5 more than new hires with no experience. He'd received exactly one raise in the past decade, when minimum wage laws had forced the company's hand. I've brought value to Precision, Juan said quietly. Last month alone, the modifications I suggested to the East Wing Assembly saved us 15 production hours per week. And we appreciate that, Juan. We do. Robert's eyes flicked to Marcus, who stood silently by the door. But this decision comes from above. Nothing personal. Nothing personal? The words echoed in Juan's head. Nothing personal about 22 years of arriving at 5 a.m. to open the facility. Nothing personal about the Christmas Eve when Juan's youngest daughter had cried because he'd been called in to fix a machine. Robert had pushed beyond capacity to meet a deadline. Nothing personal about the 3 workplace injuries he'd sustained. Nothing personal about the promotion to floor supervisor he'd been promised 5 years ago that had gone instead to Robert's nephew fresh out of college. I'm sorry, Juan, but we're making cuts. You're fired. The words hung in the air between them. 22 years. 3 children he'd put through school by working double shifts. The mortgage he'd finally paid off last year. His wife's diabetes medication that cost $400 a month even with insurance. The retirement he'd been planning for in another 5 years, a modest dream of a small house near his daughter in Arizona. Effective immediately, Robert continued, sliding a manila envelope across the desk. 2-week severance. Your benefits will continue until the end of the month. 2 weeks. After 22 years, the realization washed over Juan like ice water. 2 weeks of pay to bridge the gap until... What? What factory would hire a 57-year-old man with a bad back? What company would value his experience when they could hire 2 younger workers for the same price? Juan thought about the thousands of hours of unpaid overtime, about the workplace injury 3 years ago that he'd worked through because Robert had said they couldn't afford to have him out, even though Juan had later discovered in payroll records that Robert had received a 75-0 bonus that same year for cost-cutting measures. He thought about his friend Miguel, who lost 2 fingers in an accident last year because the emergency shutoff switch had been disconnected, a violation Juan had reported 3 times before the incident. The official report had cited worker error, but Juan had been there. He'd seen the truth. Robert's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then smiled slightly. Excuse me a second, Juan. He turned away to type a response, completely dismissing Juan's presence in the moment that was ending his 2-decade career. Juan sat silently, the envelope heavy in his hands. He glanced around the office, seeing it truly for the first time. The fishing trophies on the wall from tournaments held on workdays when Juan had covered Robert's responsibilities. The family photos, vacations taken during peak production periods when no workers were allowed time off. The sleek new furniture that had appeared after the last round of cost-cutting measures. Robert turned back, his momentary smile replaced with a practiced look of sympathy. I know this is difficult, Juan, but I'm sure someone with your experience will find something. Juan wanted to speak. He wanted to remind Robert of the night 10 years ago when a critical shipment had been due and a power outage had shut down the factory. How Juan had worked by flashlight, manually completing the assembly of 60 units. How Robert had taken full credit with the client, earning a commendation from the board. He wanted to ask about the safety inspection coming up next month, the one Juan had been preparing for by documenting all the violations that needed to be fixed. He wanted to ask who would know which areas to hide from the inspectors now, which documents to accidentally misplace. But Juan said nothing. 22 years had taught him when silence was the better option. I understand, Juan said quietly. He took the envelope, his weathered hands steady despite the storm raging inside him. Good, Robert said, already reaching for his phone again. Marcus will escort you to clean out your locker. Company policy. My tools, Juan said. I have personal tools in the maintenance room. Robert waved dismissively. Make a list for Marcus. We'll have someone gather them for you. Someone who didn't know which tools were Juan's, which were the company's. Someone who wouldn't care about the precision calipers Juan's father had given him, brought all the way from Mexico 30 years ago. They'd be lost in the shuffle, just like Juan himself. Thank you for your service, Juan, Robert said, the dismissal clear in his voice. Precision Manufacturing wishes you well in your future endeavors. Future endeavors, as if Juan had options, plans, a path forward from this moment. As if 22 years could be erased with corporate platitudes and a 2-week severance check. Juan stood, his knees protesting after sitting in the low vinyl chair. For a moment, he considered reaching across the desk, grabbing Robert by his silk tie, and telling him exactly what 22 years of service had really meant. How many times he'd saved this company from Robert's mistakes. How many workers had been injured because of corners cut. How many families had struggled because of wages withheld. But Juan simply nodded, turned, and walked out of the office. Decades of dignity packed into that simple movement. Marcus was waiting outside to escort him to clean out his locker, as though Juan after 22 loyal years might steal something or sabotage the machines he'd maintained better than his own car. As they walked through the executive floor, Juan noticed how the administrative staff averted their eyes. Everyone knew. Everyone always knew before the person being let go. The elevator ride down to the factory floor was silent. Juan could feel Marcus's discomfort, the younger man shifting from foot to foot, checking his watch repeatedly. Been with HR long? Juan asked. Not because he cared, but because the silence felt too much like a funeral. 3 years, Marcus replied, surprised at the question. Started right after grad school. Juan nodded. You like it? The work? Marcus hesitated. It's challenging. Days like this are the hardest. I imagine so, Juan said. Hard to look a man in the eye and tell him 22 years means nothing. Marcus flushed. It's not my decision, Mr. Mendoza. I just implement company policy. Juan finished for him. I understand. The elevator doors opened onto the factory floor, and the familiar cacophony of industrial machinery engulfed them. Workers glanced up from their stations, conversations stopping mid-sentence when they saw Juan with Marcus from HR. Everyone knew what it meant. As he emptied his locker, young workers averted their eyes. His friend Carlos, who'd started a year after him, gripped his shoulder silently in passing, his own eyes fearful, wondering if he was next. The new shift supervisor, Robert's nephew Tyler, watched from his glass-walled office, already making notes about how to redistribute Juan's responsibilities. You have until 5 p.m., Marcus said, checking his watch. Need to have your badge returned by then. Juan methodically packed his few belongings of thermos his daughter had given him for his 50th birthday. Its red paint chipped, but the interior still perfectly insulated. A spare set of work gloves he'd purchased himself when the company provided ones wore through after just 2 months. A faded photo of his family taped to the inside of the locker door taken at his youngest daughter's high school graduation, the only ceremony he'd managed to attend because it had fallen on a Sunday. At the bottom of the locker was a safety award from 2008, the last year the company had bothered with such recognition programs. The plaque was dusty, the engraving faded, for outstanding commitment to workplace safety. Juan almost laughed as he placed it in his box. He'd received it the same week he'd been instructed to disconnect a safety sensor that was slowing down production. His locker emptied, Juan closed it for the final time. No name tag would be removed. The company had stopped providing those 5 years ago. Another cost-cutting measure. For most of his career, this metal box had been his only personal space in the building, the only place where photographs and small comforts were permitted. Your tools, Marcus reminded him, holding out a clipboard with a form. Juan took it, carefully listing each personal tool in the maintenance room, the specialized wrenches he'd brought from home when the company stopped replacing worn equipment, the digital multimeter he'd purchased after the 3rd time the company's faulty one had caused a misdiagnosis, the leather tool belt his son had given him one Father's Day. Someone will gather these for you, Marcus said. taking back the clipboard without reading the list. We'll mail them to your home address. Some of these are irreplaceable, Juan said. Family heirlooms. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. I'll make a note, but his policy that terminated employees don't enter restricted areas after dismissal. Terminated. Such a final word. Like Juan was a machine being shut down, a process being ended, not a human with 2 decades of institutional knowledge, not a worker who had sacrificed his body and time for this company's success. As he walked through the factory floor one last time, Juan observed everything with new eyes, no longer seeing the building as a place to protect and maintain, but as a monument to exploitation. The broken guardrail they'd never fixed after Jose had fallen last year, breaking his arm. The ventilation system that had been scheduled for repair for 4 years while workers developed mysterious coughs. The corner where Miguel had lost 2 fingers because the emergency shutoff hadn't been maintained, and how the official report had mysteriously changed to cite worker error. Near the main entrance, Juan paused at the wall of safety notices and mandatory labor law postings. Among them was the company's mission statement, printed on expensive cardstock with the Precision Manufacturing logo embossed in gold, valuing our people, precision in our work, integrity in our business. Juan had helped write those words 15 years ago, part of a company culture initiative that had consumed hundreds of work hours and changed nothing on the factory floor. At the security gate, Marcus held out his hand for Juan's ID badge. 22 years, reduced to a plastic rectangle that was promptly dropped into a bin marked VOID. Good luck, Juan, Marcus said, already turning back toward the building. Marcus tough these days. One question, Juan said, causing Marcus to turn back reluctantly. When you process my severance, will you see how much vacation time I have accrued? How many sick days I never took? Marcus frowned. HR handles that automatically. It should be in your final package. Juan nodded. I have 37 unused vacation days and 22 sick days. I checked last week in the employee portal. That's nearly 3 months of time I never took. Time with my family I'll never get back. Will that be included in my severance? The HR representative's face flushed. Company policy states that upon involuntary termination, accrued time is forfeited. Forfeited, Juan repeated, like it never existed. I didn't make the rules, Mr. Mendoza. No, Juan agreed, but you enforced them. He turned away before Marcus could respond, walking through the security gate one last time, the electronic beep marking his final exit just as it had marked his entry thousands of mornings before. Juan stood in the parking lot, the manila envelope in one hand, a small box of belongings in the other. His 2010 Toyota with 187, 0 miles on it, purchased used when his eldest daughter started college, sat waiting for him with a crack in the windshield he couldn't afford to fix. The evening shift workers were arriving, nodding to him as they passed. None of them knew yet. None of them knew they were next. Across the lot, Robert emerged from a side door, climbing into his new BMW without a glance in Juan's direction. The car's engine purred to life, a sound of privilege and comfort, and Robert pulled away, probably heading to the golf course to finish the day with clients. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the industrial park. The massive Precision Manufacturing sign glowed in the fading light, the company's slogan illuminated beneath it. Excellence through dedication. Juan had dedicated 22 years of his life to this place, and now he stood in its shadow, discarded like the worn-out machines they regularly replaced. He placed his box of belongings in the passenger seat of his Toyota, the springs creaking beneath the minimal weight. The car smelled of coffee and the peppermints he kept in the console, of hard work and early mornings. He sat behind the wheel but didn't start the engine, suddenly uncertain where to go. Home was the obvious answer, but what would he say to Elena? How would he tell his wife of 33 years that the stability they'd counted on was gone? That the retirement they'd planned was now a fantasy? That the medical benefits covering her insulin would end in 2 weeks? Through the windshield, Juan watched as the shift changed, workers streaming in and out of the building that had been his second home for so long. Some faces he recognized, some he didn't. The company had increased turnover in recent years, hiring temporary workers whenever possible to avoid paying benefits. Juan had trained dozens of them, showing them how to operate machinery safely, how to follow protocols, how to survive in a place that viewed them as disposable. He thought about all he'd given to precision manufacturing, the birthdays he'd missed, the weekends sacrificed, the constant pain in his back and knees, the pride he'd swallowed when younger, less experienced workers were promoted above him, the safety concerns he'd raised that had been ignored. And what had the company given him in return? A salary that had barely kept pace with inflation, benefits that diminished every year, a gold watch for his 20-year anniversary that had turned out to be gold-plated, the plating wearing off within months to reveal the cheap metal beneath, and now a 2-week severance package after 2 decades of loyalty. As Juan finally turned the key in the ignition, his phone buzzed with a text from his daughter Maria. "How was work today, Papa? Still coming for dinner Sunday?" His eyes burned as he stared at the message. Maria was a teacher, like she'd always dreamed of being. Juan's double shifts and overtime had helped pay for her education, had helped all 3 of his children graduate college without the crushing debt so many young people faced. That, at least, was something the company couldn't take from him. As he drove home, the spring sun was setting over the city. His neighborhood was quiet, most people still at work. The modest houses with their small, neat yards showed the pride of working families, American flags, children's bicycles and driveways, the occasional basketball hoop. Juan had lived in this neighborhood for 28 years, had known some neighbors for decades. What would he tell them when they asked why he was home early on a Wednesday? His house was dark as he pulled into the driveway. Elena wouldn't be home for another hour from her job at the hospital cafeteria, where she'd worked for 15 years without a promotion despite being the most reliable employee on staff. The flower bed she meticulously maintained bloomed with spring tulips, their colors vibrant against the fading light. Juan sat in his driveway for a long time, trying to find the words to tell her that at 57, he was unemployed for the first time since coming to this country, that their careful plans were shattered, that the company picnics and holiday cards with Robert's signature thanking the precision manufacturing family had meant nothing. He clutched the steering wheel, his knuckles white, as a wave of anger finally broke through the shock. 22 years. 22 years of his life given to a company that had discarded him without a second thought. 22 years of knowledge, experience, and dedication tossed aside for a line item on a budget spreadsheet. As the anger washed through him, Juan remembered something he hadn't thought about in years. In the corner of his garage, beneath tarps and holiday decorations, stood a locked file cabinet, the one Elena called his paranoia box. He'd started keeping it 15 years ago, after the first major accident at the plant, when a worker had been severely injured and the company had altered records to avoid responsibility. Juan had been a witness, had seen the unsafe conditions, had reported them repeatedly, and when the official report came out citing worker error, Juan had begun his collection. Inside that cabinet were 22 years of documents, notes, records, photographs, emails he'd printed, conversations he'd recorded, safety violations he'd reported that had been ignored, pay discrepancies he'd documented, a thumb drive with files he'd been quietly collecting for years' insurance, he told himself, never truly believing he'd use it. The thought of that cabinet, of its contents, suddenly changed everything. The anger in Juan's chest transformed into something else, something focused and clear. For the first time since walking into Robert's office, Juan smiled. The sound of Juan's alarm pierced the darkness at 5:00 a.m., the same time it had awakened him for 22 years. For a moment, disoriented in the familiar darkness, he reached to silence it with the practiced motion of a man whose body operated on muscle memory. Then reality crashed over him. There was no job to wake up for, no factory waiting for his arrival, no machines that needed his attention before the first shift began. But still, Juan rose. Elena stirred beside him, her eyes opening in confusion. "Juan, you don't need to." "I know," he said softly, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Go back to sleep. Last night had been difficult." The words had caught in his throat as he'd explained to his wife that after 22 years, precision manufacturing had discarded him like a worn-out part. Elena had cried, not from fear about money though that would come later, but from outrage at the injustice. They'd sat at their kitchen table long into the night, calculating expenses, contemplating options, trying to make sense of a future suddenly uncertain. Juan had said nothing about the locked cabinet in the garage, nothing about the plan forming in his mind. Elena had enough to worry about. After showering and shaving with the same meticulous care he'd always taken, Juan stood before his closet, looking past the work clothes he'd worn for decades. In the back, protected by a plastic dry cleaning bag, hung his one good suit dark blue, purchased for his daughter's wedding 5 years ago and worn only a handful of times since. His mother's funeral, his son's college graduation, a distant cousin's wedding. Juan dressed carefully, the ritual unfamiliar but purposeful. The crisp white shirt, the navy tie his children had given him for Father's Day, the polished shoes usually reserved for church. He studied himself in the mirror, noticing how the suit emphasized his still strong shoulders, how it transformed him from factory worker to something else, something with authority. In the kitchen, he made coffee and toast, eating mechanically as he reviewed his plan. The documents were organized in his worn leather portfolio, one his children had given him for his birthday 3 years ago. For when you finally get that promotion to management, Papa. The irony wasn't lost on him now. As Juan gathered his keys and portfolio, Elena appeared in the doorway, wrapped in her robe, her eyes still heavy with sleep. "You look handsome," she said softly. "Where are you going so early?" Juan hesitated. His wife deserved the truth, but he also wanted to protect her from worry, from the risk he was about to take. "I have some business at Precision," he said finally. "Some paperwork they need me to sign." Elena's eyes narrowed slightly. After 33 years of marriage, she could sense when he wasn't telling the whole truth. "Juan?" He crossed the kitchen and took her hands in his. "Trust me, Elena. I need to do this." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded. "Be careful. That place has taken enough from you already." Juan arrived at Precision Manufacturing at 9:15 a.m., timing his arrival carefully. The morning shift would be fully engaged in production, the executive floor would be active with meetings, and Robert always predictable in his habits would be finishing his 9:30 coffee meeting in the conference room. The security guard at the front desk, Jimmy, looked up in surprise as Juan approached, dressed not in his usual work clothes, but in a suit that transformed him into someone almost unrecognizable. "Mr. Mendoza, I thought. They told us yesterday you were let go." "I have an appointment with Mr. Keller," Juan said calmly, his leather portfolio clutched firmly under his arm, his voice carrying a confidence that surprised even him. Jimmy looked uncertain, glancing at his computer screen where the day's approved visitors would be listed. "You're not on the visitor list. I'm supposed to call before." "It's about my severance package," Juan explained, his voice steady despite the rage still burning in his chest. There were some serious discrepancies to resolve, urgently. Jimmy hesitated, then nodded. Juan had always brought him coffee when he worked night shifts, had always remembered to ask about Jimmy's mother in the nursing home, had fixed Jimmy's car last winter when the mechanic wanted to charge him $600 for a simple fuel line problem. "I'll call up," Jimmy said, reaching for the phone. "No need to bother him," Juan replied, his eyes conveying a message that made Jimmy pause. "I'll wait in the lobby until his 9:30 meeting ends. He always finishes by 9:45. Jimmy looked at him with a mixture of respect and understanding. "You know his schedule better than his assistant does, don't you?" Juan smiled faintly. 22 years, Jimmy. I've opened this building before Robert even had his driver's license." Jimmy glanced around, then lowered his voice. "They're saying more cuts are coming. Everyone's scared." "Everyone should be," Juan replied, then softened his tone. "How's your mother doing? Still enjoying those audiobooks you got her?" The simple question, the human connection so lacking in Precision's corporate culture seemed to make Jimmy's decision. He buzzed Juan through. "I didn't see you," he said. "If anyone asks." In the lobby, Juan sat with the leather portfolio on his lap, the one his children had given him for his birthday 3 years ago. "But when you finally get that promotion to management, Papa." Inside wasn't just documentation of his termination, it contained 2 decades of meticulous record keeping. Every handwritten note from Robert asking him to stay late, every email about coming in on weekends for just a few hours, that turned into full shifts. Every pay stub showing regular hours when he'd worked far more, the training manual where Juan had been listed as safety coordinator without the 2-hour raise that was supposed to come with it, and most importantly, the safety violations, the OSHA requirements that had been ignored, the accident reports that had been modified, the workers' compensation claims that had been discouraged, the email where Robert had specifically instructed him to reroute the ventilation inspection away from the east wing, the photos Juan had secretly taken of the broken safety equipment with timestamps. For 22 years, Juan had kept his head down and followed instructions. He'd been the perfect employer, reliable, uncomplaining, invisible. When Robert had needed someone to take responsibility for implementing safety protocols without actually implementing them, Juan had been his point person. When inspectors came, Juan had been instructed which areas to show and which to avoid. And Juan had documented everything, every instruction, every cover-up, every false report, not because he'd planned this day, but because something deep inside him had always known it might come. At 9:47, Robert's 9:30 appointment walked out of the elevator a young consultant in an expensive suit who didn't even glance at Juan. At 9:50, Juan stood and walked to the reception desk on the executive floor, his heart pounding but his steps steady. "Juan," Robert's secretary, Diane, said with genuine warmth and visible discomfort, "I'm so sorry about what happened. It wasn't right. We all said so in the break room after." "Thank you, Diane," Juan said quietly. "Is he available? I need just a few minutes." Diane looked at her screen, biting her lip. "He has a call at 10, but..." She pressed the intercom. "Robert, Juan Mendoza is here to see you." There was a pause. Then Robert's voice came through the speaker, irritated. "I'm busy, Diane. Tell him to contact HR if he has questions about his package." Juan leaned toward the intercom. "It's not about the package, Robert. It's about the OSHA violations, and the unpaid overtime, and the modified accident reports, and the emails where you instructed me to falsify safety documents." The silence stretched for nearly 10 seconds. "Send him in," Robert finally said, his voice tight. Juan entered the same office he'd sat in yesterday. Robert stood behind his desk, his face flushed, his carefully cultivated executive calm already cracking. "What's this about, Juan? If you're trying to..." Juan opened his portfolio and set it on the desk. On top was a thumb drive. 22 years of documentation, Juan said simply. "Every instruction you gave me to cut corners on safety. Every hour of overtime you told me would be made up to me later. Every accident report you told me to change." Robert's face darkened. "You can't prove." "The backup generator installation in 2018, Juan continued calmly. "You said we didn't need to bring it up to code because the inspectors never checked that area. I have your email." "The ventilation system in the East Wing that fails OSHA standards. I have the report showing we knew it since 2016. The unpaid overtime, I have time-stamped security footage of me entering and leaving the building compared with my official time cards." Robert slowly sat down. "What do you want, Juan? Money? Is that it? Because if you think you can blackmail me..." "No, Robert. I want justice," Juan said, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "Not just for me." He slid a document across the desk. It wasn't a simple lawsuit, as Robert clearly expected. It was a comprehensive plan for worker safety improvements, back pay for overtime hours for all affected employees, and the establishment of a workers' rights committee within the company. "You implement this, or tomorrow I take everything I have to OSHA, the Department of Labor, and the press." Juan's voice remained steady as he placed a second document on the table. "And this is a separate file I've prepared for the IRS about the company's creative accounting of worker hours and safety compliance costs." Robert stared at the documents, then at Juan, genuine fear flashing across his face. "You can't do this. The company would face millions in fines. I could personally face charges." "Yes," Juan said simply. "Criminal charges, most likely. Especially for Miguel's accident. You remember Miguel? Father of 4? The report says operator error, But your email to me says to disconnect the safety sensor because it was slowing down production. And you're willing to do that? Destroy the company? After all these years, you'd put hundreds out of work. Juan leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. For 22 years, I was afraid. Afraid of losing my job, of not providing for my family. Yesterday, you took that fear away from me. You freed me to finally do what I should have done years ago. The office fell silent. Through the window, Juan could see the factory floor below, workers moving through their routines, just as he had for so many years. People who deserved better. You have until 5 p.m. today to sign this agreement, Juan said, standing up. At 5, 1, I make 3 phone calls. By tomorrow, there will be federal investigators walking through that door instead of me. Robert picked up the documents with trembling hands, the hands of a man who had never operated heavy machinery, never felt the vibration of the industrial press for 16 hours straight, never wrapped a bleeding finger in a rag to finish a shift. The board will never approve this. The costs alone would. Your choice, Robert. The board can pay fair wages and fix safety issues, or they can pay millions in fines and legal fees, and you can face an investigation. Your call. As Juan walked to the door, Robert called after him, desperation in his voice. You'll never work in manufacturing again if you do this. I'll make sure of it. Juan turned, a small smile on his face. I already have a new job, Robert. Carlos's brother-in-law owns a shop across town. With my experience, he offered me a position yesterday, full benefits, regular hours, and all overtime paid. He even asked if I would help implement proper safety protocols. Turns out, treating workers well is actually good business. He put his hand on the doorknob. One more thing. The agreement includes no retaliation against anyone still working here, including Jimmy at the front desk who let me in today. 22 years of loyalty meant something to him, even if it didn't to you. Juan walked through the office, past startled employees who'd heard about his termination, head high for the first time in years. He nodded to Diane, who smiled with tears in her eyes. As he reached the elevator, his phone buzzed. A text from Carlos. Is it true? Security said you went to Robert's office. What happened? I'll tell you later, Juan texted back. Meet me at Miguel's after work. Juan hadn't expected the news to travel so quickly. By 3 p.m., his phone was buzzing constantly. By 4 p.m., Carlos called to tell him that Robert and 2 board members were in an emergency meeting. By 4:30, the company lawyer had arrived. At 4:55 p.m., as Juan sat at his kitchen table, Elena nervously making coffee for the 3rd time, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Mendoza? A woman's voice said. This is Patricia Winters, chairperson of the Precision Manufacturing Board of Directors. I understand you've presented some concerning documentation to Mr. Keller today. Juan's heart hammered, but his voice remained calm. Yes, Ms. Winters. The board would like to meet with you tomorrow morning. I've already made my terms clear, Juan replied, and would like to discuss them in person. 8 a.m. There was a pause. Mr. Keller will not be present. At 8 a.m. the next day, Juan again sat in the boardroom, but this time across from 5 board members and their lawyers. By noon, he walked out with a signed agreement for everything he demanded, plus something he hadn't expected, a formal consulting position to oversee the implementation of the new safety protocols, with a salary that was 3 times what he'd been making. We had no idea, Patricia Winters had told him privately after the meeting. Robert has been creative with his reports to the board. This isn't just about avoiding fines, Mr. Mendoza. It's about fixing a culture that should never have been allowed to develop. By the end of the week, Robert had been asked to resign. By the end of the month, federal investigators were still combing through years of records. But with the company's full cooperation, by the end of the quarter, back paychecks had been issued to dozens of workers. And Juan, who had opened the factory gates at 5 a.m. for 22 years, now arrived at 8:30 in the morning in a small office with his name on the door, Juan Mendoza, Worker Safety and Compliance Director. On his wall hung a simple frame containing his first business card and a handwritten note from Miguel, who had received the largest settlement. Some justice comes late, but because of you, it came. The fear that had been Juan's constant companion fear of losing his job, of not being able to provide, was gone. In its place was something he hadn't expected: respect, not just from others, but finally, after 22 years, for himself. "I understand," he had said to Robert that day in the office, and now, at last, he truly did. If you enjoyed Juan's story of standing up for what's right, please like, comment, and share this video with others who might need this message of courage and justice. Subscribe to see more stories like this one that remind us all of our power to make a difference. Reintentar Claude puede cometer errores. Por favor, verifique las respuestas.